Sandra Mitchell had spent the last 11 years of her life caring for others. As a one-year-old emergency room nurse, she had witnessed the fragile boundary between life and death more times than she could count. She had held the hands of the dying, whispered prayers into the ears of the unconscious, and watched monitors flatline on patients she had fought so hard to save. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for the moment when it would happen to her. It was March 9th, 2026, when Sandra's world collapsed in an instant. She had just completed a grueling double shift at a regional hospital in the Pacific Northwest. Exhausted to her core, she stepped out into the cold morning air, walked toward her car, and felt a sudden crushing pressure in her chest. Her vision tunneled. Her legs gave way beneath her. Before anyone could reach her, Sandra Mitchell had collapsed in the hospital parking lot, her heart in full arrest, her body completely still on the cold pavement. By every clinical definition that Sandra herself had been trained to recognize, she was dead. But what happened in those next several minutes, what Sandra experienced in that space between heartbeats, is something she says she will spend the rest of her life trying to fully describe. The moment everything changed, Sandra later described the experience as stepping out of a heavy coat she had been wearing her entire life. One moment, she was the exhausted nurse collapsing beside her car. The next, she was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that defied every physical law she had ever been taught to trust. There was light, but it wasn't like any light she had ever seen during her years under fluorescent hospital bulbs. This light had weight to it. It had warmth. It had a kind of intelligence that she felt rather than saw. She describes it as a light that knew her every version of her, every chapter of her life, every fear she had buried beneath her professional composure. I didn't walk toward it, she explained in the days following her recovery. It walked toward me, or maybe a better way to say it is it simply was, and I was simply in it. Within that light, a presence emerged. Sandra, a woman of quiet but deep faith, recognized immediately who stood before her. She felt it before she saw any form, the way you sometimes sense a person enter a room before you turn around. There was an authority to this presence, not intimidating, not cold, but absolute. Absolute love, absolute knowing. It was Jesus. The message begins. Sandra describes standing before this presence, feeling completely seen and completely accepted at the same time, two things she had never fully experienced simultaneously in her earthly life. All judgment dissolved, all pretense fell away. And then, without spoken words in the way we understand speech, communication began. The first thing she received was not a warning. It was a question. He looked at me with eyes that I can only describe as ancient and gentle at the same time, Sandra said, and he asked me if I understood how deeply the elderly were loved. Not appreciated, not respected, loved. There's a difference. That question opened something in her. She began to see in the way NDEs often produce, seeing that is more like knowing a series of images and truths that unfolded around her, like pages of a living book. She saw seniors, thousands of them, across America, across communities, across nursing homes and kitchen tables and church pews. She saw their loneliness. She saw the weight many of them carried, decades of memories, losses, wisdom that the world had stopped asking for. And in the same vision, she saw something else entirely. She saw what was coming, what Jesus revealed about March 23rd through 28th. The presence before her began to show her a specific window of time. Sandra emphasizes that she was not given numbers or a calendar in the way we might flip through a planner. Instead, she received what she calls an impression, a spiritual certainty that settled into her like a deep breath. The window was March 23rd through March 28th, 2026. Within this window, she was shown that something significant was approaching, not simply for the nation at large, but specifically and intimately for the elderly population. Sandra describes it as a convergence, multiple pressures arriving at once. She saw economic tremors, not a single dramatic crash, but a tightening, a squeezing. Decisions being made in rooms far away from ordinary people that would ripple outward and land hardest on those with fixed incomes, those on Social Security, those whose financial margins had already been worn thin by years of inflation and rising costs. The elderly, she was shown, would feel this pressure most acutely during this specific window. But that wasn't all. She also saw what she describes as a wave of confusion and misinformation sweeping through the information landscape. Seniors, many of whom still rely on traditional news sources and social media shared by well-meaning family members, would be exposed to a flood of conflicting messages about health, about safety, about what was true and what wasn't. The confusion would be disorienting. Some would make decisions based on false information. Some would isolate further out of fear. He wasn't showing me these things to create panic. Sandra is adamant about this point. There was no fear in the way he revealed it. It was the way a doctor explains a diagnosis clearly, so the patient can prepare, so they can act wisely, so they don't walk into something blindly. The blessing hidden within the warning. Here is where Sandra's account takes a turn that surprises many who hear it for the first time. Because even as she was shown the challenges arriving in that late March window, she was simultaneously shown something extraordinary waiting on the other side of it. She saw a blessing. A specific, divine blessing aimed directly at the generation that had been largely forgotten or overlooked by a culture obsessed with youth and speed. Sandra describes it as a spiritual awakening among the elderly, a stirring that would begin precisely because of the pressure they were being asked to endure. She saw seniors, who had perhaps drifted from faith or from community, suddenly returning, suddenly remembering, suddenly finding in themselves a depth of spiritual resilience that shocked even their own families. He told me that those who have lived the longest carry the deepest reservoirs, she said, her voice breaking slightly as she recounted it, and that what was coming was not designed to drain those reservoirs. It was designed to open them. She saw grandparents becoming spiritual anchors in their households. She saw elderly men and women praying with a fire she described as the kind she had never witnessed, even in the most charismatic church services. She saw them sharing testimonies not despite their age, but because of it, because they had lived long enough to have something true to say. This was the hidden gift inside the difficulty, a divine invitation for the generation that the world had set aside to step back into the center of something sacred. What she was told to share, before Sandra felt herself being drawn back toward the parking lot pavement, back toward the sound of voices and the sensation of her chest being compressed by her colleagues who had found her, she received what she calls a commission. It was not complicated, but it was urgent. She was told to speak. Specifically, to speak to those who care for seniors, the nurses, the aides, the adult children, the pastors of congregations heavy with gray hair. She was told that the people in this particular profession and calling were being asked to pay closer attention during the March 23rd to 28th window. Not to be afraid, but to be present, to be watchful, to be the kind of steadying presence that the elderly would desperately need during those days. She was also told something she hesitates to share, but feels compelled to say. He told me that how a nation treats its elders in moments of crisis is a direct reflection of that nation's spiritual condition. Not its military strength, not its economy, its heart, how it treats the ones who built it. Sandra paused after sharing this, both in her private accounts and in the interview she eventually gave. Then she added quietly, he said, America is at a crossroads on this specific issue, and the days between the 23rd and the 28th would be a moment of testing, not for the seniors themselves, but for everyone around them. Coming back and what changed Sandra regained consciousness on the pavement outside the hospital. Her colleagues had initiated CPR within moments of her collapse. The defibrillator had been used. Clinically speaking, she had been without a viable heartbeat for nearly 4 minutes. She opened her eyes, looked up at the gray Pacific Northwest sky, and wept. Not from pain, not from fear, from the weight of what she had just been given to carry back with her. In the weeks that followed, Sandra made significant changes. She transferred to a geriatric care unit, something her supervisors initially questioned, given that she had spent her entire career in emergency settings. She began visiting elderly patients not just during their clinical care hours, but during her personal time, sitting with them, listening to their stories, asking questions that most hospital staff never had time to ask. She also began talking cautiously at first, then more openly about what she had experienced on March 9th. The response has been overwhelming. Families of elderly patients have reached out. Other healthcare workers in geriatric settings have described a strange restlessness in their own spirits during the same time frame, a sense that something significant is building. Several seniors themselves, when Sandra has carefully shared pieces of the vision with them, have responded not with skepticism, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as if something deep in their own spirits already knew. A final word from Sandra. Sandra Mitchell is not someone who chases attention. Her colleagues describe her as steady, science-minded, and grounded, which is perhaps why her account carries the weight it does for those who know her personally. When asked what she most wants people to take away from her experience, she doesn't hesitate. Don't wait until March 23rd to start paying attention to the elders in your life. Don't wait until there's a crisis to sit down next to your grandmother and actually listen. Don't wait for the window to close before you realize what was available inside it. She leans forward when she says the final part. He didn't show me those days to frighten anyone. He showed them to me because he loves the people who are going to walk through them, and he wanted someone to go back and say, "You are seen. You are known, and what is coming is not the end of your story." It might be the most important chapter yet, the story of Sandra Mitchell, a nurse who died in a parking lot on March 9th, 2026, and came back carrying a message about seniors, about March 23rd through the 28th, and about the divine love reserved for those the world has overlooked, is one that refuses to be easily dismissed. Whether you encounter it as a matter of faith, as a matter of curiosity, or as someone who has an elder sitting just one phone call away, the message at its center is simple and ancient and urgent all at once. The ones who have lived the longest still have something essential to offer, and the days ahead may be exactly when the world needs them most. Watch until the very end. Share this with someone who has someone to check on, and pay attention to what stirs in your own spirit as you do.